Police tasered deaf black man for not listening. They didn't know he was deaf. The shrill whine of sirens pierced the evening air, the rotating blue and red lights glaring off the rain-slicked pavement in harsh, dizzying patterns. Tall silhouettes emerged from the police cruisers with an urgency that suggested a grave threat, flashlights slicing through the darkness like predatory beams in search of their target. Their stern faces were set in grim lines, and every motion they made seemed coordinated, practiced, and unflinching. But across the street, near the entrance to a small convenience store, a lone figure stood frozen, clutching a messenger bag against his chest. The man's eyes were wide with alarm and confusion as he watched the approaching officers. He could read the tension in their body language, sense the danger in their eyes, but he could not hear a single syllable of their shouted demands. Elijah Davis could feel the vibrations of their voices reverberate against his chest, but he had no understanding of the words that bellowed from their throats. Born profoundly deaf, he had spent his entire life navigating a world that often overlooked him and rarely took the time to communicate in a way he could understand. Standing there, illuminated by the store's buzzing neon sign and the rapidly strobing police lights, he felt an unsettling tingle of dread. He had seen something like this on television, the fractious encounters between young black men and police officers, but he had always believed that, if he moved carefully and communicated patiently, he might avoid such confrontations. Tonight, though, the tension was already so thick that it felt like the atmosphere itself was coiling in anticipation of violence. He raised his hands, an instinctive sign of peaceful intent, and tried to convey that he could not hear. His palms faced outward, trembling slightly, fingers spread apart in what he hoped was an unmistakable gesture to stand down. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, only a breathy attempt at a sound. He then pointed to his ears, shaking his head as if to say, "I can't understand you." The officers continued shouting orders that grew more frenzied, more urgent. Elijah's gaze flickered frantically, searching for a way to show them he posed no threat. One officer, tall and broad-shouldered, barked what sounded like a final warning. The tension that had been simmering in the humid air boiled over in a matter of seconds. They wanted him to get down, to stop moving, to comply. Elijah, shaking, tried stepping backward, gesturing more wildly to indicate his deafness. He fumbled for the small card he often carried in his pocket, one that stated, "I am deaf. I communicate using American Sign Language. Please write notes to communicate." He never had a chance to hand it over. He saw the quick, practiced motion of a hand unclipping the taser from the officer's belt, saw a pointed metal muzzle lifted in his direction, and a look of lethal resolve in the officer's eyes. A moment later, sharp barbed probes shot out, trailing thin wires behind them like flickering snakes, and latched onto Elijah's jacket. The crackling of electric current slammed into Elijah's body with punishing force. His muscles seized in an uncontrollable spasm, and he collapsed onto the wet asphalt with a thud. He felt a momentary blaze of agony, then a hollow numbness. The officer standing above him shouted something Elijah would never hear. Another burst of electricity rippled through him, and the world dissolved in blackness. In the long moments that followed, the only sound in the air was the hum of departing thunderclouds, distant car horns, and the ragged breathing of uniformed men realizing the enormity of what had just transpired. The confusion that weighed on the officers was immediate and evident. Nobody was sure if they had stopped a dangerous suspect or made an irreversible mistake. Elijah lay on the ground, chest heaving, uncomprehending. He could taste the metallic tang of blood in his mouth, though he hadn't realized he'd bitten his tongue when he fell. As one officer moved in to secure Elijah's wrists with handcuffs, he noticed the battered plastic card that had tumbled out of Elijah's coat pocket. It lay face up on the pavement, illuminated by the flashing lights. The words printed in bold letters read, "I am deaf, I need assistance." For a split second, the officer's hand froze mid-motion. He looked up, eyes darting to his partner, and an unmistakable flicker of panic twisted his features. The partner caught the expression and shone a flashlight onto the card. At that moment, they both understood that the situation was far more complicated than they had initially assumed. Elijah was not resisting, nor was he ignoring their commands. He had never heard them. Their rapid calls to halt, the repeated commands to get on the ground, the frantic threats of deploying a taser. Elijah had perceived them only as a menacing commotion, an inexplicable flurry of aggression. And now, battered by electric shocks, he was lying on the ground, panting in terror, with the taste of blood stinging his tongue. The tall officer swallowed hard, his face paling in the light of the. He muttered something into his radio. Soon, bystanders began to crowd around at a safe distance, cameras capturing the surreal spectacle. Some were already yelling, he's deaf," in outraged voices that only added to the swirling confusion. An ambulance was called. The paramedics arrived, gingerly placing Elijah onto a stretcher and checking his vitals. While they did so, they tried to reassure him with gentle eyes and soft touches. He looked at them, frightened but grateful for some sign of understanding. He wanted to communicate, but his ability to sign was made clumsy by the lingering tremor in his arms. One paramedic recognized a few basic gestures of American Sign Language and did her best to console him, signing slow words like "okay" and "help." Though far from fluent, she managed to convey that they were taking him to the hospital, that he was going to be examined, that he should not be afraid. The officers, meanwhile, had retreated to their vehicles, huddled in a heated discussion. Some were on their radios, presumably relaying the incident to superiors. Others were shaking their heads, their expressions a mixture of anger, fear, and confusion. The tall officer who had fired the taser was especially pale, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill settling over the city. He glanced repeatedly at the ambulance, where Elijah was being secured. He seemed to want to walk over and say something, anything, but he remained rooted to the spot by a crippling blend of shock and guilt. Soon, the swirling lights departed, the throng of onlookers dispersed, and the city's nocturnal rhythm resumed. Yet in its wake was a mounting tension, an undercurrent of outraged voices, swirling rumors, and the relentless hum of social media. By the time Elijah reached the hospital and was placed in a hospital bed, numerous versions of the event had already cropped up online. Some said the man was a threat, refusing orders. Others insisted it was a clear act of brutality against a deaf black man. Videos taken by onlookers were posted on various platforms, each capturing the moment Elijah collapsed as the taser barbs latched onto him. The incomplete narrative, often filmed from awkward angles, was enough to stoke the fires of public outrage. Doctors evaluated Elijah's injuries, lacerations on his tongue and lip, bruises along his arms and torso, and burn marks where the taser's probes had made contact. He signed anxiously to the nurse, desperate to know if he was in legal trouble, if the police were still there, if he was safe. She did her best to calm him, scrawling in a notepad, "You're not under arrest right now. The police want to ask questions. They said they might come by. Focus on your health first." He read the words, relief mingling with dread in his dark eyes. He managed a trembling nod and sank back into the pillows. He lay there for hours, drifting in and out of an uncomfortable doze, haunted by the memory of the taser's shocking jolt and the searing brightness of the officer's flashlights. Every time he blinked, he could still see those intense beams bearing down on him. He tried to recall if he'd inadvertently done something threatening, tried to understand how the situation had spun out of control so rapidly. Whenever he'd imagined police trouble, he'd thought it would start with an officer who might try to talk to him, maybe even question him in writing. Never had he truly believed he might get simply for not responding. He felt, for the first time, the crushing weight of vulnerability, a sense that the world's precariousness could snatch his safety away at any moment, simply because he could not hear. Meanwhile, across town, the events of the night were weighing just as heavily on another person's mind. Officer Ron Millstone, the tall officer who had pulled the taser's trigger, sat in his patrol car, parked in a deserted lot under a flickering streetlight. He had turned off the engine, wanting a moment of stillness to collect his thoughts. Inside, a storm was raging. He replayed the incident over and over, the dispatch call about a potential disturbance at the convenience store, the frantic shouts of the store clerk who had mentioned a man out front who wouldn't leave, the arrival of the police cruisers, the direct order to approach, and the quick escalation. By all accounts, he had followed protocol. He told himself that, but the sudden realization of Elijah's deafness felt like a heavy anvil of guilt pressing down on his chest. He was no stranger to tense encounters. He had served in the force for 8 years, but he could not recall a single instance in which he had intentionally harmed someone with special needs. The knowledge that Elijah had not heard his commands, that the deaf man had tried to communicate in sign, gnawed at Ron's conscience like an insidious termite. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, eyes shut, trying to quell the roiling guilt. Over the radio, dispatch crackled with mundane updates. He turned it off with a sharp twist of his wrist, as if he could momentarily silence the entire outside world. It didn't help. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion. a sense of betrayal at the incomplete information provided at the scene, a frantic worry about the media storm that would inevitably follow, an annoying fear that perhaps, despite all the training, he had panicked. At the hospital, hours melted into morning. The dim glow of dawn seeped through the window blinds, and Elijah woke to find a new nurse writing something down on a clipboard. She greeted him with a gentle smile and pointed to her badge. "Hello, my name is." Then, noticing he was awake, she grabbed a sheet of paper and scribbled, "How are you feeling?" He let out a shaky breath, lifted his hands, and slowly spelled out his response in sign. Realizing she didn't fully understand, he typed a message on his phone instead. "Not good, hurts everywhere, am I in trouble?" Read it, frowned, and wrote back. "The police want to speak with you when you're ready, but you're not officially under arrest. Focus on healing. Is there anyone we can call for you?" Elijah thought about his mother, Davis. She lived across town in a modest apartment, caring for her elderly mother. He also thought of his best friend, who had worked with him at the Deaf Community Center. He typed, "Please call my mother. She's hearing but she knows the signs. I want her here." Nodded, placed the paper aside, and left to make the call. Within an hour, arrived, wide-eyed and fraught with worry. She hurried into the hospital room, tears brimming at the sight of her son's battered form. She ran to his bedside, signing furiously, "My baby, what happened? Are you okay?" He explained as best he could, telling her about the confusion, the sudden approach of the officers, the unstoppable rush of electricity that had felled him. His face twisted in outrage and anguish, and she hugged him, mindful of his bruises. Through tears, she promised him that they would find justice, that they wouldn't let this event be swept under the rug like so many other cases of police brutality. She had heard rumors, read headlines, seen the viral videos that were popping up on social media. But this was her son, flesh of her flesh, whose only crime was existing in a world that sometimes refused to see or hear him. That morning, a detective visited Elijah's hospital room, accompanied by an interpreter. She wore a grave expression, introducing herself politely before launching into questioning. She wanted to piece together the events of the previous night. The interpreter tried to keep pace as Elijah recounted every moment he could remember. The confusion of the police lights, his frantic attempts to show he was deaf, the sudden, breathtaking agony as the taser's current coursed through him. The detective asked methodical questions, her eyes occasionally flickering with concern, but her posture remaining professional. Elijah and both could sense her concern was genuine, but they also feared the system's capacity to swallow up the truth. In the meantime, local media outlets had caught wind of the story. Headlines read, "Police taser deaf man, claim he ignored commands." Another source used an inflammatory title, "He couldn't hear their warnings. Deaf black man TASED in shocking video." The footage taken by bystanders circulated with staggering speed across social media, each iteration unleashing a torrent of comments. Some viewers leaped to defend the police, arguing that the situation was tense and that Elijah must have been acting suspiciously. Others expressed outrage, citing the centuries-long history of marginalized communities suffering brutal mistreatment at the hands of those in power. Hashtags started trending, calls for protests emerged, and tensions simmered across the city, threatening to erupt. 2 days after the incident, Elijah was discharged from the hospital, with instructions to follow up with a neurologist for any lingering effects from the taser. Bruises still adorned his arms and chest like dark, mottled clouds, and his spirit was heavily burdened by a growing sense of distrust and fear. Guided him out to her car. News cameras were waiting, but hospital security kept them at a respectful distance. The reporters shouted questions he couldn't hear, though he could see the frantic movements of their lips. He turned away, feeling overwhelmed. In the car, he signed to his mother, "I'm not ready for all this. I just want it to stop. I want the world to leave me alone." Alex smoothed his hair gently, tears threatening the corners of her eyes again. She signed back, "I know, baby, but we have to stand up for what's right. Maybe we should talk to a lawyer. We need to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Elijah nodded, resigned to the battle that lay ahead. He wasn't an activist by nature, but if this nightmare could ensure no other deaf individual ever ended up for not responding, perhaps some good might come of it. At the precinct, tension also simmered behind closed doors. The department's public relations officer, flanked by the police chief, gave a statement to the media acknowledging the incident, pledging an internal review. The chief maintained that the officer believed Elijah was resisting arrest, but also acknowledged that the department took the incident very seriously. Off camera, behind the scenes, several officials debated how best to handle the fallout. Some argued that the officer was following protocol in an uncertain situation. Others said that the entire force should undergo deeper training regarding interactions with individuals who have hearing impairments or other disabilities. Lawsuits loomed, protests were being planned, and the tension felt like a ticking time bomb. One voice that resonated through the community belonged to Dr. Pierce, a passionate advocate for deaf rights and a beloved figure at the local deaf community center. She had seen the video of Elijah's and was incensed. Her fury was not just for Elijah, but for every deaf individual who had been misunderstood, disregarded, or endangered simply because they could not hear. She called Elijah's mother, introduced herself, and offered the support of the community center. "We're with you," she said through a video relay service. "Whatever legal aid you need, whatever emotional support, we're here." Elijah found himself in the middle of a whirlwind of activism. He was invited to speak at an awareness rally, though he couldn't find the courage or energy to stand before a crowd just yet. Protests sprang up near City Hall, with signs that read "Deaf Lives Matter" and "He couldn't hear you." Some specifically targeted issues of systemic racism in policing, connecting Elijah's experience to a larger tapestry of Black men and women brutalized or killed in encounters with law enforcement. Others focused on the deaf community's plight, calling for comprehensive training for all first responders on how to communicate with deaf individuals. During this time, Elijah barely left his mother's small apartment. His phone buzzed endlessly with messages, calls, and social media alerts, but he hardly checked them, overwhelmed by the surge of attention. He spent most of his hours lying on the couch or pacing restlessly between the living room and kitchen, fighting off nightmares whenever he tried to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the scene replayed: the flash of the taser, the electric shock burning through his body, the helplessness. In his waking moments, he was consumed by anxious thoughts. How could he ever trust an officer again? How could he walk down the street without fear that someone might think he was disobeying commands he couldn't hear? Worried that he was sinking into despair, coaxed him into seeing a therapist who specialized in treating deaf patients with trauma. At first, Elijah resisted. He'd never spoken to a mental health professional before. But after a couple of restless nights, plagued by the memory of his limbs seizing under that merciless voltage, he agreed to try. On the day of his first appointment, he walked into a bright, sunlit room with soft chairs. A kindly older woman named Doctor took a seat across from him. She had a warm smile, and next to her, an interpreter was ready to facilitate their conversation. Elijah felt his initial apprehension begin to fade as he explained, in halting sign, everything that had happened. Doctor's gaze was filled with compassion. She didn't rush him or push him to relive every detail. Instead, she guided him through gentle questions, encouraging him to express not just what happened physically, but the emotional wounds he carried. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, with time, the trauma could recede into something more manageable. Days turned into weeks, and tensions remained high in the city. Protests continued, sometimes meeting with counter-protests from groups that claimed the police had done nothing wrong. Elijah's story spread further than he ever anticipated. Journalists reached out, wanting interviews. National-level activists contacted him. Legal advisors approached, some with genuine offers of help, others seemingly fishing for a high-profile case. The swirling confusion and chaos left Elijah feeling paralyzed. Did her best to protect him, screening calls and only letting close friends and supportive advocates connect with him. Meanwhile, Officer Ron Millstone found his life turned upside down. A formal investigation had been launched into his actions. He was placed on administrative leave while the internal review proceeded, and he found himself at the center of a media firestorm. Reporters camped outside his home, neighbors whispered, and his family avoided public places for fear of confrontation. Some of his colleagues around him, insisting he was a good cop who had made a split-second decision in a tense situation. Others whispered that he should have taken more care, that the video evidence looked damning. Ron struggled with all of it. His initial surge of guilt had fused with resentment over the vilification he faced in the public eye. Yet beneath that swirl of conflicting emotions, he knew that something had gone wrong that night, very wrong, and that, had he been more patient or more observant, the outcome might have been different. He could not shake the memory of Elijah's terrified eyes as the taser prong struck him. In his nightmares, he saw those eyes over and over and saw the moment of confusion that turned to terror. In the corners of Ron's guilt-ridden mind, he wondered whether that image would ever let him rest again. One afternoon, the department arranged a meeting between Ron, a representative from the police union, and an internal affairs officer who planned to interview him about the incident. Ron arrived with red-rimmed eyes, having spent a sleepless night rehearsing what he would say. The union representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Sandra, guided him through the conversation, emphasizing that he had followed training, that the suspect, Elijah, had failed to comply with verbal commands, that it was a high-stakes environment. But every time Ron parroted that defense, he felt a stab of dissonance. He wanted to explain that Elijah hadn't heard him, that it was a tragic misunderstanding. He wanted to say that maybe, just maybe, the training needed to be better. Maybe he had jumped to the taser too quickly, but he knew such an admission could be used against him in the review, possibly ending his career and leading to criminal charges. So he swallowed his guilt, forced himself to speak the prepared lines, and left the meeting feeling hollow. Back at home, he was greeted by the sight of his wife, Lisa, hunched over the kitchen table, tears in her eyes as she watched a news report. Their two kids were shut in their rooms, having endured side-eyed looks at school, rumor-laden whispers in the hallways about their father. This was the new reality for the Millstone family, ostracized, criticized, and under a microscope. Lisa tried to ask him how the meeting went, but he barely managed a few words, exhaustion gripping him. She tried to comfort him, but their closeness felt undermined by the knowledge that, no matter how she tried, she couldn't erase what had happened, and she couldn't stand between him and the consequences he might face. In the weeks that followed, Elijah's story exploded onto the national stage, igniting debates on talk shows and cable news networks. Deaf advocates seized the opportunity to highlight the unique challenges deaf people face when interacting with law enforcement. Civil rights groups pointed to the racial undertones of the incident, arguing that unconscious biases may have heightened the officer's perception of threat when dealing with a black male. Police representatives insisted the incident was unfortunate, but pointed to the dangers officers face daily, emphasizing the split-second decisions they must make. Elijah eventually met with a civil rights attorney named, who specialized in police misconduct cases, was a slender man with an unassuming presence that belied his fierce litigation skills. After carefully reviewing video footage and witness statements, he laid out Elijah's options. They could file a civil lawsuit against the police department for use of excessive force. Elijah, uncertain and fatigued by the entire ordeal, asked a simple question through a certified deaf interpreter. What would that accomplish? Explained, it could bring about a monetary settlement or court-awarded damages for the pain and suffering you endured. It could also pressure the department into implementing better training practices for officers, especially in how to communicate with deaf individuals. Elijah's gaze lowered. Money wasn't his chief concern. He wanted to ensure no one else endured the terror he had felt, but he knew from others that lawsuits often took months, if not years, draining emotional reserves and overshadowing the rest of one's life. Still, with quiet determination, he agreed to proceed, hoping that speaking out might prevent another tragedy. As the legal wheels slowly turned, the protest movement gathered steam. Marches sprang up with signs that read "Justice for Elijah" and "Deaf Lives Matter." Local activists organized peaceful demonstrations, culminating in a mass gathering at a downtown park, complete with sign language interpreters, deaf keynote speakers, and supportive hearing allies who wanted to see substantive changes. On a drizzly Saturday morning, a crowd of hundreds gathered, umbrellas dotting the park like a field of colorful mushrooms. Elijah stood on a small stage, trembling despite the sincere applause. He hadn't wanted to speak, but Dr. Pierce had gently convinced him that his words, delivered in the language closest to his heart, would mean a great deal to those in attendance. With the help of an interpreter, he signed his speech. His hands moved haltingly at first, but soon a fervent passion infused his movements. He told them about the fear, about lying on the asphalt feeling the crackle of electricity searing his body, about a lifetime of smaller indignities, people speaking behind him, ignoring him, dismissing him. He spoke of the hope that someday, deaf children would grow up in a world where they could walk the streets without fear, where police officers had the tools to communicate effectively with them. Tears flowed freely in the crowd. Some were deaf themselves, relating all too well to the frustration of a world that refuses to acknowledge their communication needs. Others were hearing allies, stunned into compassion by the raw, heart-wrenching account of brutality inflicted on a man who simply couldn't hear. Journalists recorded Elijah's speech, broadcasting it live on several platforms. It quickly went viral, prompting a renewed wave of empathy and activism across the nation. In the days following the speech, the police department issued a statement saying they were reviewing protocols for interacting with deaf individuals and had begun working with local deaf advocates to design new training modules. Many praised the department for this step, but others questioned whether it was a genuine move toward change or merely a public relations strategy to quell criticism. Meanwhile, the internal investigation into Officer Millstone stretched on, as these processes often do, with witness interviews, body camera footage analysis, and legal counsel weigh-ins. Ron's frustration and anxiety mounted. He felt his life was suspended in a grim limbo. He couldn't return to active duty, and the stigma attached to the incident followed him wherever he went. Each day, the news covered the story, replaying the taser footage in slow motion. He saw the look on Elijah's face the moment the barbs hit him, stunned, agonized, uncomprehending. It gnawed at him. Yet, whenever he shared these feelings with the few colleagues who would still speak openly with him, they told him to keep quiet, to trust the process, to protect himself. They told him to think about his family, to not let guilt overshadow his own well-being. He found no solace in their words. Late at night, he would scroll through news reports about the protests, occasionally clicking on the unending stream of online comments, many of which called for him to be fired or even arrested. Some threatened violence, naming him a racist or a monster who preyed on a deaf black man. He tried to remember that internet comments were often extreme and polarized, but the labels still stung. They planted seeds of bitterness and self-doubt that blossomed into restless nightmares. One day, as the weeks dragged on, the police department scheduled a meeting between Ron, Elijah, and a professional mediator from the city's Human Relations Commission. The department hoped that, by facilitating a structured conversation, tensions might de-escalate and they could find some common ground, or at least open lines of communication. When Elijah first received the request, he recoiled. The idea of sitting across from the man who had shocked him into the pavement felt unbearable. But after some coaxing from Doctor, his therapist, and after discussing it with his mother and lawyer, he reluctantly agreed. The meeting was set in a neutral location, a plain conference room in the city's municipal building, with pastel walls and fluorescent lighting that hummed overhead. A circular table stood in the center of the room, surrounded by chairs. Elijah arrived with a certified deaf interpreter. Ron arrived with his union representative. The mediator, a calm-eyed older gentleman with a patient demeanor, invited everyone to sit. The tension crackled in the air, thick as static. Ron, fidgeting, couldn't seem to meet Elijah's gaze. Elijah stared down at the table, refusing to look up. The mediator began with a gentle introduction, emphasizing that this meeting was not a legal proceeding or a place for admissions of guilt, but rather a chance for each party to express their feelings, to understand and be understood. Elijah nodded curtly, not quite believing that any conversation could repair the deep trauma he felt. Still, he stayed, because some part of him wanted to hear what this man, who had, in a blink of an eye, altered his life forever, had to say. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he looked up, took a shaky breath, and signed, "You changed my life. You took away my safety. You made me afraid to leave my home." The interpreter's voice conveyed those words to Ron, whose face twitched with emotion. Elijah continued, "I couldn't hear you, but you didn't wait to find out why. You just assumed I was a threat. If I weren't black, would you have used the taser so quickly? Or if you had known I was deaf, would you have chosen a different approach?" Through each question, Ron squirmed in his seat. He glanced at the mediator, who gestured gently for him to respond in his own time. When Ron finally spoke, his voice was halting, thick with conflicting emotions. "I was afraid. It was dark and the call said there was a possible threat. I didn't know you were deaf. I swear I didn't. If I had," he trailed off. His eyes shimmered with remorse. "I've been haunted by this every day since it happened. I can't make excuses. I should have waited. I should have done something differently. He swallowed, struggling to continue under the weight of Elijah's unwavering stare. "I'm sorry," he finally managed, voice trembling. "I know that doesn't change anything. But I need you to know I'm not a monster. Maybe I panicked. I don't want to hide behind the word mistake, either. What happened is worse than a mistake. It's a tragedy, and I was part of it." The room was silent. Elijah's lawyer watched carefully, wary of how this admission could be used in legal proceedings. The union representative looked tense, as if wanting to intervene and caution Ron to remain quiet. But the mediator let the silence linger, giving space for raw emotion and truth to emerge. Finally, Elijah signed again. "I hear your words, but it still hurts." The interpreter hesitated, realizing the unintentional pun in Elijah's sign. "I hear your words, but voiced them as close to literal meaning as possible." Do you have any idea what it's like to never hear the sirens, to never understand the commands, to have your entire existence misunderstood, and then to be shot with a taser just because you can't comply with words you can't even detect? Ron's face contorted in anguish. He shook his head, tears glinting at the edges of his eyes. "No, I don't know what that's like," he said, voice ragged. "But I wish I had tried to understand. I'm sorry." What followed was not a clean resolution or a neat tie-up of conflicting emotions. It was messy, uncomfortable, and deeply painful. Elijah expressed the fury he had held inside, signing with such intensity that tears slipped down his cheeks. Ron wrestled with guilt and fear for the future of his career and family, but in that bleak, fluorescent-lit room, something tangible passed between them. Not forgiveness, not entirely, but a fragile thread of understanding. By the time they parted, Elijah felt some of the suffocating weight lift from his heart. Not much, but enough to breathe a little easier. Over the following weeks, Elijah continued therapy and eventually found a sense of renewed purpose at the Deaf Community Center. He began volunteering more regularly, speaking to groups about police encounters and guiding them on best practices if they ever faced a similar situation. He discovered a new calling. Becoming an advocate, teaching deaf youth about legal rights, about how to carry cards or wear alerting wristbands that let others know they can't hear. The center, spurred by Elijah's ordeal, organized workshops in partnership with local law enforcement, training that included sign language basics, sensitivity training, and real-world practice. Whether the program would lead to lasting change was unclear, but it was a start. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuit proceeded, drawing public attention to the depositions and court filings. The police department, for its part, initiated new policies aimed at bridging the communication gap. Critics accused them of doing too little, too late, but some, including Dr. Pierce, believed the policies were evidence of the power of collective outrage and advocacy. She continued to champion Elijah's case, ensuring his story reached anyone who would listen. Months later, a legal settlement was reached. The city agreed to compensate Elijah for the physical and emotional harm inflicted upon him. More importantly, they committed to expanded training measures that would be monitored by an external panel, ensuring accountability. Elijah accepted the settlement with mixed emotions. Money could never erase the trauma, never fully heal the emotional scars. But perhaps it could open doors for him, further education, a chance to become a certified deaf interpreter or a social worker, continuing his newfound passion for advocacy. Officer Ron Millstone faced disciplinary action. The internal review concluded that while he adhered to certain protocols under the assumption of a non-compliant suspect, he had failed to assess crucial indicators that Elijah might have been disabled. He was suspended for several months without pay, required to undergo additional training, and transferred to a desk position. Whether he could ever fully regain public trust or his own peace of mind was uncertain. Still, in fleeting moments, he remembered the emotional meeting in that conference room and the look on Elijah's face when he spoke of never hearing the sirens. Ron carried that memory like a thorn in his side, painful, but motivating him to be more vigilant, more empathetic, more aware. In the aftermath, the city found itself in the midst of profound reflection. News pundits debated who was to blame, whether race played a significant factor, whether the department's training standards were wholly insufficient, and how future crises could be prevented. Public discourse shifted, if only slightly, toward questions of how the deaf and hard of hearing were systematically excluded from emergency response considerations. Lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens all began to pay closer attention to the interplay between race, disability, and policing. Elijah carried on, forging a new chapter in his life. In the warm days of summer, he visited local high schools to speak to deaf students. He demonstrated simple techniques, like carrying an official deaf identification card in a prominent place, ensuring that it could be easily seen if they were approached by authorities. He educated them on their legal rights, telling them that in a just world, it shouldn't be necessary, but they lived in a world that was not yet just. The students hung on his every sign, simultaneously inspired by his resilience and sobered by his cautionary tale. Emotionally, Elijah's journey was far from over. Nightmares still intruded on his sleep, though with less frequency. Sometimes, passing a police officer on the street triggered a panic response that made his heart hammer uncontrollably. But with therapy, advocacy work, and the unwavering support of his mother, he learned to navigate these triggers. He found that sharing his story lessened the weight of it, forging connections with others who also felt invisible or marginalized. Every time he saw a conversation spark about deaf awareness, every time a new training initiative was implemented in a neighboring district, he felt a small glow of hope. Gradually, public interest in his story receded. Another news cycle replaced it with fresh scandals and controversies. The protest crowds dispersed, the hashtags stopped trending, and the city's daily life resumed its usual rhythm. But for Elijah and those close to him, the night he was etched into their consciousness, an indelible reminder of how swiftly misunderstandings could escalate to violence. In the hush of the everyday, the real battles continued, in city council meetings, where budgets for new training were debated, in living rooms where deaf children were taught about the complexities of the hearing world, and in the hearts of those whose trust in law enforcement had been irreparably shaken. Looking back, Elijah often felt a swirl of complex emotions. He thought about the injustice of that night, the tangible pain of the taser's shock, and the intangible wounds of having his humanity disregarded. But he also recognized the small but meaningful changes that had occurred in its wake. He met hearing officers at the new training sessions who were earnest and eager to learn sign language. He saw educators adding police encounter exercises to deaf curriculum, and he, timid and reserved by nature, found himself standing in front of audiences, telling his story with a kind of quiet authority he never realized he possessed. On an early autumn day, Elijah found himself back at the convenience store where it all began. He had not been there since the incident, but part of his therapy involved confronting the places and memories that fueled his anxiety. With measured steps, he approached the entrance. His heart thudded in his chest, but he kept going, determined. The cashier, who recognized him, looked startled at first, then offered a respectful nod, mouthing what appeared to be an apology. Elijah gave a small nod in return. He walked the aisles, picking up a few items: milk, bread, a soft drink, mundane tasks that felt monumental under the weight of recollection. When he reached the spot outside where he had stood that night, he paused, inhaling the crisp autumn air. He closed his eyes, letting the wind brush against his face. In his mind, he could still see the dancing lights of the cruisers, feel the flutter in his stomach as the officers shouted incomprehensible orders. A shiver coursed through him. Slowly, though, he forced himself to see beyond that moment, to see the small steps of progress that followed, the dialogues, the trainings, the lawsuits, the painful but necessary conversations. He opened his eyes, searching for a sign of that old terror in the present day. But the street was quiet, the sky bright with early morning sun. Life moved on, indifferent yet full of possibility. He hoisted his messenger bag more securely on his shoulder, the same bag he had clutched that night, and walked away. Across town, in a small suburban house, Officer Ron Millstone sat alone in his kitchen. The television was muted, but images of a new national controversy flashed across the screen, reminding him of how quickly the public's attention shifted. He sighed, shutting it off. In the quiet, he reflected on the mandatory training he had recently attended, training that now felt vital, illuminating gaps he never knew existed in his understanding of the deaf community. Perhaps the department had begun to shift. Perhaps he too had begun to shift. He closed his eyes, remembering Elijah's face at that mediation, the raw pain in his eyes, and the simple, searing question: would you have acted so fast if I weren't black, or if you knew I was deaf? It haunted Ron still. Perhaps the question didn't have a singular answer. Perhaps its truth was layered in biases he hadn't confronted in himself. Yet the question loomed over everything, demanding that he be more self-aware, more empathetic, and less reactive. In the city at large, life progressed in small increments. The deaf community grew bolder and more unified, hosting events and training sessions that forged new alliances with hearing citizens. The city council, pressured by activists, allocated funds for better inclusive resources, such as providing visual alerts along with auditory cues in public spaces. The police department integrated mandatory deaf awareness modules into its academy curriculum, taught by deaf instructors who refused to let future officers graduate without a fundamental understanding of sign language and cultural sensitivity. Elijah, for his part, quietly continued his work. His story became a catalyst for local reforms, and while he was far from comfortable with public notoriety, he used it when necessary to amplify the message that deaf people have rights, that communication barriers can be fatal if not addressed. Over time, he did find moments of genuine peace, reading a book at the community center's small library, strolling through a quiet park with his best friend, or sharing a silent conversation with his mother over dinner, where their hands told stories far richer than words ever could. Though the memory of the taser remained etched into him like a scar, Elijah slowly molded that pain into a tool for advocacy, ensuring that his suffering might spare someone else. The city had changed, even if just slightly. People now use the phrase, Elijah's Law, informally when talking about the new training requirements for officers. Politicians cited his case as a turning point in bridging the understanding gap between law enforcement and the deaf community. And local deaf children learned about his bravery, seeing him as a testament to resilience and the power of standing up against injustice. Years later, if one were to ask Elijah Davis how he managed to find hope amidst such adversity, he would likely respond with a sad but resolute smile. Through sign, he might say something akin to, "I had no choice," or "My silence was never an option." He might recall the jolt of that taser as a moment that split his life into a before and an after, and he might tell you that this fracture, though agonizing, led him to discover a voice within himself he never knew existed. A voice that spoke through his hands, carried the weight of his experiences, and demanded that the world listen, even to someone who could not hear its sounds. He would tell you that while the officers' lights that night seemed blinding, they illuminated harsh realities that needed to be confronted. And he would tell you that in the end, they had to keep confronting them, through legislation, through training, through conversation, and through compassion, because there were countless others out there, deaf or otherwise marginalized, who risked being misunderstood and harmed by a system ill-equipped to meet their needs. His story, he would say, wasn't just about pain or even about condemnation. It was about the possibility of change, one step at a time, as long as people never stopped caring enough to make their voices heard or their signs seen. And in that way, the incident that once threatened to break him instead became a catalyst for transformation, not just in the life of Elijah Davis, but in the life of a city that learned, painfully and earnestly, that to truly serve and protect its citizens, it must learn to communicate with every single one of them. The memory of that night lingers still, a heavy shadow, but within that shadow rests a small flame of hope, quietly burning, guiding others toward a kinder future where no one is brutalized or dismissed simply for not hearing a command. And it is in the glow of that flame that Elijah continues walking, step by determined step, into a world he believes can, if it wills, listen better than it ever has before.